All right. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining to this webinar today that is going to be about the key elements for the land sector in INDCs guidance and in the draft climate agreement. Today we are going to have a couple of presentations, one from the Nature Conservancy with Pippa Elias and Jason Fong with the Union of Concerned Scientists. So can we advance please to the next slide? So before we start with the topic, or today's topic, and with the presentations, I just want to run you through some rules for making this experience the most efficient as possible. So if you could close extra browser windows, that normally makes the quality of the communications better. And we will have a couple of presentations, and then we have separated some time to have questions and answers. So please hold your questions until the end of the session, and submit your questions through the questions box that is in your tool in the bottom of the box of the webinar. And yeah, we will be recording this webinar, so you will be able to access it later through different portals. It will be in our YouTube channel as all our webinars, but there will be also, we can reach out and provide the recording if you are interested. So next, please. So just to walk you through what we are going to talk today, I'm going to be giving a little bit of an introduction on why talking about this topic is important, and then we are going to go to a presentation about the guidance for INDCs preparation and the relevant provisions for the land sector, that is going to be delivered by Pippa Elias from TNC. And then we are going to go to a presentation talking about the current status of the land use sector in the draft climate agreement, and that's going to be delivered by Jason Fong. Then later we'll have hopefully enough space for questions and answers. Next slide, please. Okay, so for just to start, I just want to make sure that I highlight that this webinar is a part of a series of efforts by a coalition of organizations that we've been working together for the past couple of years. This coalition includes Conservation International, the Environmental Defense Fund, Forest Trends, National Wildlife Federation, the Nature Conservancy, the Union of Concerned Scientists, and World Wildlife Fund. And we have come together to promote the recognition of the positive role that the land sector can and must play to positively contribute to the fight against climate change. We also aim to generate spaces for open, inclusive, and transparent dialogue among several stakeholders, in particular among parties or governments and civil society. And we aspire to really build consensus and find solutions about this topic. We have hosted several events in the past. Normally we have a workshop or a dialogue during the climate negotiations that take place in the summer in Bonn, but we have also had dialogues in the past, COP20 in Lima, in the Global Landscape Forum, and we try to promote these spaces to just reflect and recognize that land is crucially important in terms of climate change, not only in terms of adaptation, of course, but also in terms of helping to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees. So this, the land sector it has many particularities, of course, highlighting the importance of the sector for food security, but also we aspire to promote and to recognize what is the potential of including the land sector in a new climate regime, recognizing that the sector contributes with 25% of the global emissions. So that is just to give you the context of why are we talking about these issues and how these efforts have been coming together. And also just to let you know that most of these events and efforts have been made possible thanks to the support of IUCN's Forest and Climate Change Program. So with that, I think we are ready to start with our presentations today, and I'm going to hand it to Pippa Elias from the Nature Conservancy, who is going to talk about the adopted guidance for INDCs preparation that came out from Lima. And she's going to highlight out of these guidelines what are the important provisions for the land sector and what is important to know in this context. So Pippa,
great,
all yours.
Rafina. So just a little bit of background. Josefina just explained kind of what my presentation outline will be, but just want to introduce the main acronym that I will be using today, which is INDCs, which are Intended Nationally Determined Contributions. And this is the information that each country is putting forward in the run-up to the climate negotiations in Paris. And it's what each country is going to do on mitigation and in some cases adaptation, the actions that they're proposing to take. And it's expected that after the negotiations in Paris, these will turn into nationally determined contributions. This will be what countries are actually taking home to do in their country. So INDCs are bottom-up, which means that each country can take the approach that they find most appropriate for themselves. But what I'm going to walk through is some general guidance that has been provided in terms of content that ensures transparency and promotes environmental integrity. So far, we have seen 12 INDCs submitted to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, but one of those represents multiple countries because it is from the EU. And I won't today go into kind of what we have seen on each of them from the land use sector, but rather just walk through the decision that was made at the Conference of the Parties meeting in Lima and walk through each paragraph and how the guidance for developing INDCs relates to the land sector. So we can jump right in. So if you go to the next slide. Great. So this is the first of a number of paragraphs from the Lima decision that provides guidance on INDCs. And invites each party to communicate its INDC and how that achieves the objectives of the convention as set out in Article 2. So next slide. One of the first important elements of this guidance is that it applies to all countries because each country is expected to provide some kind of INDC, even if they look different, because each country has, say, a different level of capacity to reduce their emissions. Article 2 of the objective of the convention is really the heart of addressing climate change. It's about minimizing the impact of anthropogenic climate change. So since land use and land use change contribute to about a quarter, just under a quarter, of all global warming emissions, it's possible to take this guidance and think that all INDCs should, in some way or another, address the land use sector, because it's really unlikely that Article 2, the objective of the convention, could be met without addressing emissions from the land use sector. Next, please. This paragraph agrees that each party's INDC will be used to meet the objective of the convention and will represent a progression beyond what the party is currently doing. Next slide. So the key to the land use sector here is that INDCs should go beyond what countries are already doing. So many countries are already taking action to reduce emissions or increase sequestration from the land use sector. So information needs to be provided in the INDC that indicates why these proposals are a progression. So examples in the land use sector could be including new lands. So for example, a country that had only been working to reduce emissions from forestry could indicate that they'll be progressing by also including emissions from agriculture as well. Or a country could indicate that they're going to use higher your IPCC guidance to increase the accuracy of measuring their emissions in the land use sector. So there's a lot of different options to show that the land use sector is progressing beyond current approaches. So next slide, please. So this paragraph is another agreement that least developed countries and small island developing states can communicate their information in the terms of strategies, plans for actions for low greenhouse gas emissions development. And this is because they have special circumstances. So go to the next slide. You know, it's pretty specific to just these countries, but they're encouraged to still provide strategies, plans, and actions that could lead to low emissions development. So of course land use can be a critical component of this, especially because in some of these countries land use is actually one of their main sources of emissions. So for example, this could be interpreted to show that the INDC could include an indication that with financial support, these countries may want to participate, for example, in REDD+, in the program to reduce emissions from deforestation and degradation. Next. So this paragraph invites parties to consider also including in their INDC, in their communications, their undertakings in adaptation planning, or adaptation in their INDCs. Next. So adaptation has a lot of overlaps with the land use sector because adaptation is not only important for ecosystems, but also land use, forests, and agriculture can actually contribute to adaptation. So one example actually in the current INDCs that we have seen is that for Mexico, they decided that in their country, forests actually fall mainly in their adaptation approaches. So adaptation has a lot of overlaps with land use, so this could be part of the INDCs. Next slide. So this paragraph, again, reiterates its invitation to countries to communicate their INDCs well in advance of the Paris meeting and in a manner that facilitates clarity, transparency, and understanding of the INDCs. So next slide. This is one of the most, oh, sorry, can you go back one? Yeah, thank you. So this is one of the most critical paragraphs for ensuring that INDCs are expressed in a way that allows other countries or stakeholders to really understand what is in an INDC, because it calls for their transparency, clarity, and understanding. And we know these characteristics are particularly important for the land use sector because clarity, transparency, and understanding are really important for engendering confidence that this sector can play an important role in climate change mitigation. So how would a country go about doing this? That's actually mostly in the next paragraph. So if we look at paragraph 14, which is the next slide. So this is really long, I'm not going to read it, but if you go to the next, I'll just focus on a few critical pieces of this paragraph. So we can go to the next. Perfect, thank you. So here's a list of some of the information that can be used to meet the invitation for clarity, transparency, and understanding. And all of these can kind of be interpreted in terms of how they relate to the land use sector. So I'm going to run through these. So quantifiable information on the reference point is critical for evaluating the progress of emissions reductions. And for the land use sector, it could be a year, it could be a REDD reference level, or it could be a LULUCF reference level. There's different ways it could be done, but that information is absolutely critical for the land use sector. Timeframes and or periods of implementation. For a lot of countries, this is going to be the same for all sectors, including the land use sector. But if a country does decide to use a different time frame or period, specifically for the land use sector, that needs to be expressed clearly in the INDC. Scope and coverage. This is really important for the land use sector because approaches in land use can encompass so many different activities. So, for example, just within REDD Plus for developing countries, there are up to 5 different activities that could be included. Deforestation, degradation, sustainable management of forests, enhancement of carbon stocks, or conservation of carbon stocks. So that all needs to be clearly defined. For other countries, we might want to know whether or not they're including agriculture or coastal ecosystems. So a critical point here is that most of the existing guidance to countries from the UN on the land sector indicates that if it's going to be included at all of the significant sources of emissions need to be in the scope. And there's an IPCC approach to determine which sources of emissions are significant. So that's really important when I'm considering what would go into an INDC on the land use sector. So there's a couple more pieces to breaking down this paragraph. Assumptions and methodological approaches. There's a number of ways approved by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change to approach the measurement and accounting for emissions and sequestration from the land use sector. So it's critical that in an INDC, the country details the approach they will take because that information really is the only way to ensure that paragraph 13 of having clarity, transparency, and understanding occurs. So it's really critical. But again, it could vary from country to country. So I also highlighted this little phrase on emissions and as appropriate removals, because this is a really big hook for the land sector, because it's the only one that currently has removals, which is sequestration of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So language like this is really an encouragement for countries to include the land sector in their INDCs. And finally, I want to touch upon the idea of INDCs, including the consideration of how the proposal is fair and ambitious. As I said earlier, since the land use sector accounts for about 1/4 of emissions, and because it's the only sector that can help achieve climate change mitigation by also sequestering carbon, including the sector is pretty critical for ambitious action on climate change. So that's another kind of hook for including the land use sector in INDCs. So next slide. Oh, can you go back one more? I think we skipped one. Okay, maybe it's not there. Okay, sorry, I had a kind of a conclusion slide, but I can just walk through it or speak through it. But I just kind of want to reiterate the last point I made on the importance of the land use sector in meeting the objectives of the convention of really reducing climate change. It really needs to be included in the actions countries take in order to achieve that goal of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Also, the agreement in Paris is really, as I said, kind of being built from the bottom up from INDCs. So it really is important for it to be an agreement that actually addresses climate change, actually moves us forward for countries to show that they are progressing, that they are doing more, they will be doing more than they are right now. And so the expanded inclusion of the land use sector is really a way that countries can do that. And I also just kind of want to emphasize again the importance of the fact that there are many different methodological approaches to measuring and accounting for emissions in the sector. So countries really need to state the approaches they're going to take to ensure there is clarity, transparency, and understanding. And the final point I want to make that I think will lead quite a bit into Jason's presentation is that none of these paragraphs actually mention the land use sector or forests or agriculture or any of the activities that are encompassed under land. But yet we can kind of look at the language and understand that there are a lot of hooks for the sector, and there's a lot of ways that this language applies to land use even if the actual phrase isn't there. So with that, I'll wrap up, and I'm looking forward to having a discussion after Jason's presentation.
Thank you, Pippa. And sorry, I think with the edition we lost your last slide with the conclusions, but thanks for walking us through them. So what we just heard is like the guidance that has been approved and that was coming out from the discussions in the COP in Lima with respect to how countries need to prepare their national intended contributions, as Pippa explained to us. But now we are going to shift with Jason's presentation towards what is the status of the land sector in the current draft of the climate agreement that is under discussion in the Durban platform in the UNFCCC. So it's the other piece of the puzzle. We have seen what countries need to take into consideration when developing their commitments that are going to be submitting or their contributions. And now we are going to see how is the text of the agreement actually providing incentives or considerations for the land sector. So, Jason, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. And good morning, everyone. Looks like we have a pretty good list of folks listening in, including some friends, old friends and new friends. So hope that this is informative for you. As Josefina mentioned, I'm going to talk about the current status of the land use sector in the draft climate agreement. And I want to be clear that what I'm going to talk about is referring to the version of the text that came out at the end of Bonn. So if you go to the UNFCCC website, look for the Bonn meeting, and then look at the ADP track, you'll find a couple documents referred to there. And this one's the one called Streamlined and Consolidated Text. It's the version from the 11th of June at 1630, to be very specific. But there won't be any confusion. It's the only text like this. And then this document is closely linked and sort of represents an evolution of the Geneva text. And so you can also find that text. Much of the language is identical, but what you will find is that some of the paragraph numbers have changed. So helpfully, in the streamlined and consolidated text, it gives references back to the paragraph number that it came from in the Geneva text. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm just going to give 4 themes today as I walk through the text. I'm going to describe the significance of some of the language that we have in here. It's still a pretty hefty document of about 85 pages. So it takes a while to work your way through and then identify the language that's relevant to the land sector. So I'm going to talk about 4 different ways that the land sector is included or referred to or affected by the text that we have now. As we look ahead to Paris, this will further get consolidated, so we need to keep an eye on these different things as they evolve and proceed. So first I'm going to talk about a section of some highlights of places where the land sector is explicitly referred to in the text as a sector or through its distinctive characteristics or the specific mechanisms that are aimed at the land sector. Then I'm going to move into a section where I talk about some of the implicit references to the land sector that are in the text. And those happen through references to the land sector's distinctive value to people and its particular vulnerabilities to climate change. So, for example, there are several places where we see references to safeguarding food production, which echoes the original convention language in Article 2, and I'll point out where some of those occur. The third theme I'll talk about then is an important one related to some places where we have detailed principles that are necessary to help ensure the environmental integrity of the ultimate agreement for the land sector as well as for other sectors. And these options in the text, they have a good bit of support from several countries, but because they are still options in bracketed text, we can't yet guarantee that these principles will last through the end of Paris and that they'll be included in the final agreement. So it's something to keep an eye on. And then finally, I'll talk about some other issues where they occur in the text and the land sector and its accounting would be affected by some issues that are potentially controversial and may not be resolved until sort of the very end of the Paris meeting. And that might possibly impact the way commitments are expressed, particularly in the land sector. So, for example, there are issues related to force majeure or natural disturbance events. And I'll point out where those are. Okay, so what's going to happen next is that we're going to start to walk through these 4 different kinds of themes, and this is going to be a guided tour of the text. So, like many guided tours, I won't spend a great deal of time, and you might want to come back and look at these sections later. And I'm also not going to be covering every single reference or part of the text that could be linked to the land sector. I'm going to try to draw out the most important highlights. And so I'll be moving relatively fast, and what you probably want to do, if this is of interest to you, is just make a note of the paragraph numbers on each slide, and then go back and take a look at them in the text. It does take some time to sort of drill down and figure out where these things are. The text has been really reshuffled, and so the paragraphs are no longer in numerical order in many cases. But you can find this language in there, and then you'll get a sense of the broader context of where these things exist. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we see references to the land sector starting right off in the preamble of the text. This is preamble paragraph 20. And it says, you know, we're going to, the parties will recognize the special characteristics of land use systems, including the importance of food security, the diversity of global land management systems, etc. And so this is an explicit reference highlighting the importance of the land sector, which is something PIPA also emphasized and mentioned was emphasized in the Lima Agreement. And if this language were preserved, it would make it very clear that, right, as an overarching theme in a preamble, that the land use sector is important. Next slide, please. And then as we work our way through the sections of the text, we find some explicit references, especially in the mitigation section. Here's an example that's pretty important from paragraph 21. It's buried down in option 6. But it talks about how, as countries implement their commitments in accordance with the principles of the Convention, they should enhance the implementation of their commitments through promoting sustainable management, promoting and cooperating in the conservation and enhancement, as appropriate, of sinks and reservoirs of all greenhouse gases. So when it says sinks and reservoirs, that refers to the land sector primarily, forest, agricultural land, wetlands, places where carbon can accumulate through the action of vegetation and other processes. And so that kind of language makes it clear that the land sector is going to play a role here. Next slide, please. There's also language in a few other paragraphs in the mitigation section that indicate that mitigation activities won't be limited to developed country parties if this language is accepted in the final agreement. So there are actually many references through the text to this idea of joint mitigation and adaptation approaches, or what we often just refer to as JMA. And that's promoted by primarily one country with support of a few others, where the idea is that, you know, in the land sector especially, it's appropriate to consider how mitigation and adaptation can work together in a synergistic way. Going down to the next paragraph, 37, here we have an example of an explicit reference to the Warsaw Framework for REDD+, and then also activities under the Kyoto Protocol, where appropriate, for forest mitigation, and then other approaches such as JMA. So this paragraph sort of captures this basket of past decisions and approaches that have been developed for the land sector and would carry them forward in the Paris Agreement and say, well, we can still use these. We're not discarding any of this, including the obligations that occur under each of those different approaches. So that's more or less taking what we've already got and making sure that it moves forward into the post-2020 world. Next slide, please. This is an example of a paragraph, again, in the mitigation section, and it just illustrates primarily that the land use sector is one that can be used to meet commitments. The transfer of mitigation outcomes or units can be passed back and forth between parties or traded. And especially for REDD+, that these can be transferable units used to meet commitments in other countries. So this is supporting the idea that mitigation can be transferred, or the credits accumulated can be transferred in the way that REDD+ might work through a trading mechanism or crediting mechanism. Next slide, please. And then in another section of the agreement, we have references again to REDD+ in particular. There are also some references to JMA under the finance section, indicating that financial mechanisms can be applied to these types of approaches and that they will be part of the overall agreement. So just to illustrate that this does happen in various different sections, there are references to the land sector. Next slide, please. And then again, at the toward the end, the section on transparency of action and support, paragraph 173, which is about the way parties will communicate their contributions, that to facilitate the clarity, transparency, and understanding of those contributions, they should include all of the different types of guidance that were developed in Lima for INDCs, including the extent to which the land sector is included in their INDC, and a specification of how it will account for all significant lands, activities, pools, and gases. So here's an example of, in the transparency section, the land sector can be built into this idea of the contributions that countries will put forward, and it's language that would indicate acceptance of the land sector in those contributions. Okay, let's move ahead to the next slide now. This is the beginning of the section where I'll point out some implicit references to land use in the text, and I'll just give a few examples to sort of highlight how this appears. One example here on this slide is in the general and objective section. Paragraph 5 has an option that basically echoes and reaffirms the original intention of the convention under Article 2. Toward the bottom, you see that highlighted text, which says the goal of the agreement is to limit greenhouse gases in the atmosphere in order to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change, so as to ensure that food production is not threatened, etc. So the use of the words food production here links back to the convention language. It is implicating that the land sector will play a role or be affected by this agreement. In the original convention, the idea was that we wanted to limit climate change so that it did not impact the ability of people to produce food. And this has also been subsequently reinterpreted by some parties to think that also the actions that we're taking to limit climate change and the policies we enact shouldn't interfere with the ability to produce food. So both climate change itself and the policies we take to try to remedy it should not interfere with food production. So here this is just bringing the land sector in, identifying its importance and the fact that it serves multiple purposes, and that we want to try to be careful in the way that we engage in these activities, but also to safeguard those other uses that the land sector provides, or other benefits. Okay, next slide, please. We see similar language in the mitigation section in terms of the overall goal or the long-term objective of the Paris Agreement. Again, we see food production mentioned as one of those goals to ensure that it's not threatened. Okay, next slide, please. And then here's an example from the adaptation section. Paragraph 1, option 1 says that all parties commit to cooperate to adapt to the adverse conditions of climate change and ensure the resilience and protect citizens and ecosystems. So the reference there, both to resilience and to ecosystems, brings in a linkage to the land use sector because those are the ones that are going to be highly affected by climate change itself and will require some adaptation or could benefit from some adaptation activities. And resilience and the protection of ecosystems identify some goals that can be achieved that are relevant to the land sector. Okay, next slide, please. All right, now we're moving on to the third theme, where we're going to talk about some principles necessary for the land use sector and some that are relevant to other sectors as well. This is something that I think is very important, and I want to emphasize and make sure that we spend a bit of time on it so everyone understands its importance. So these principles, the first time we see principles referring to the land use sector specifically is in the mitigation section, and it's in paragraph 39. And we have this list that occurs, first starting with general principles in paragraph 39.1, and then we have a paragraph 39.2 where we have land use principles more specifically. So the general principles talk about, there are several of them here, the net changes from sources and removals by sinks. There's a linkage to the land sector right there in the language of removals and sinks. Part B talks about all major sources of anthropogenic emissions, so it's not excluding the land sector. Part C talks about key categories, which is a way to use IPCC guidance to identify the most important sources and sinks. And those have specific methodologies for how to incorporate the land sector. So once again, using that guidance would mean that the land sector would come into play for most countries where it is a significant source or sink. Next slide, please. We have a number of further principles here, and these are generally applied, so they are for all sectors, but they are especially important for the land sector too. So the use of consistent methodologies for estimation and reporting, and then for to ensure that consistency occurs here in subparagraph E, parties should use the same baselines, accounting and methodologies, and approaches. And the land sector is one for which baselines and accounting methodologies are especially important for ensuring the environmental integrity of the accounting there. Subparagraph F here talks about projected reference levels and other dynamic baselines, which are a feature of the land sector accounting under the Kyoto Protocol. So this would bring forward those types of approaches and the way that they're allowed and sort of constrained within the Kyoto Protocol. It would say that those approaches can continue under the Paris Agreement as well. And then subparagraph G, we have a warning of avoiding double counting, which is also important. Next slide, please. So all of those were principles that would apply to all sectors, but you can see clearly how they're especially important in the land sector. And then following that, we have another section in paragraph 39.2, which has land sector principles called out, which are specific to that sector and not necessarily as relevant for the other sectors. So we would like to see in subparagraph A both emissions and removals being accounted for. Subparagraph B is the idea that there's no backsliding, or sort of once a source, sink, or activity is accounted for, it should not subsequently been excluded from accounting without an explanation. So that's something that's very helpful to ensure that comprehensiveness increases over time, and parties can't sort of pick and choose the types of accounting they want to do in order to get a windfall in any particular accounting period. Subparagraph C talks about the definitions of forest, land use, and activities should be consistent. That's also a safeguard for environmental integrity to ensure that parties can't change things up to benefit themselves. And then subparagraph D, parties may apply the principles and methodologies of existing approaches under the convention using IPCC guidance where applicable. That's very important so that we're all using consistent guidance that's been vetted and developed over time using the best science. Next slide, please. We have a few more here related to the land sector. This subparagraph E, just continuing this section, talks about the fact that parties may exclude emissions and removals resulting from natural disturbances consistent with the most recent IPCC guidance. So this is something that comes from the Kyoto Protocol development of accounting methodologies. Parties agreed that there was a need to be able to exempt some of these emissions from natural disturbances in their accounting, and this language would allow that to carry forward into the Paris Agreement, and it would here apply to all parties, apparently, is the intent here. And then subparagraph F says the parties should strive to exclude from accounting non-anthropogenic emissions and removals. So here this would provide, would ensure that the focus of accounting is on what people are doing and the activities they're undertaking in land management. There's a lot happening in the land sector that allows fluxes of greenhouse gases into and out of the sector that has nothing to do with human activities. And so in order to provide the right incentives and ensure that parties are getting credit and disincentives for things that they're doing themselves, it's very important to make sure that the focus is on anthropogenic emissions and removals, and so the others should be excluded wherever possible. And then we have another section just beyond that. 39.3 talks about, for market accounting principles, there should be no double counting, and that's something that is important for the land sector, for the environmental integrity there too. Okay, so that's paragraph 39 in the mitigation section, and that's something that pretty much encompasses everything that some of our coalition would be looking for in the agreement. Maybe not the exact language we would love, but by and large it's a comprehensive approach to the different principles we'd like to see applied to all sectors and the land sector in particular. If you look at the next slide then, we see another example much later in the text in paragraph 151, and this is a different section. It's under the transparency section of the text, and here again we see references to the development of accounting rules applicable to all parties, and we see a smaller set of principles that would apply to all of the sectors, and they're a bit more general than the ones that we saw in paragraph 39. And we also have a set of 3 principles that would apply specifically to the land use sector, and they more or less echo some of the things we saw in that earlier paragraph. So this is just to illustrate that we have principles that would be applied to accounting, and they exist both in the mitigation section and then they exist again in the transparency section. And it might end up that they are, they could end up in either one of those or both in the final agreement. But it's worth keeping an eye on them and understanding the differences and similarities in these 2 different options. I suspect that they might end up being consolidated as we go through, but it's worth noting what's included in each one so that we don't lose anything important along the way. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is moving into the 4th and the final theme of this presentation, just looking at some issues through the text that may affect the land use sector, even though there's no direct reference or linkage to the land sector. And here I'll keep this at a very high level and just refer to a few things with the idea that the folks on this call or this webinar might want to keep an eye on these sections and see how they evolve and develop over time, because they are going to have implications for the land use sector depending on how they are resolved. So here I'm not going to list the text because in many cases there's a whole variety of options. But as you go through the transparency section in particular, paragraph 140 has a set of options for constructing a transparency framework, and all of those, that transparency framework, regardless of how it's constructed, will have implications for the land sector. Paragraph 142 has options further detailing how monitoring, reporting, and verification, or MRV, fits into that framework to deliver transparency. So that's also very important. MRV was a key focus of the development of the REDD+ mechanism, and ideally a lot of that work would be carried over into the rest of the land sector in countries that even beyond the ones participating in REDD. So the way that MRV is incorporated in the Paris Agreement overall could be quite important. And then in paragraph 144, we have rules and modalities for transparency. Many of the options there would reaffirm the existing guidance and allow parties to continue to build upon the MRV outcomes that we already have, as well as their experiences in implementation. So taking a look at those options and understanding what's in there and watching that, that paragraph evolve over time is going to be something that will be quite important, especially for RED+ countries. Okay, next slide, please. This is the last part of the text that I wanted to talk about in some detail. This is an issue in the section related to timeframes and process related to commitments and contributions, as well as other matters related to implementation and ambition. This is section J. And paragraph 180 talks again about this issue, which we call natural disturbances or force majeure. It gives a few different options, which all of them in some way or another would allow parties to adjust their commitments or contributions if a force majeure occurs. I'll accept option 4, which says no further adjustments allowed. So this one, it doesn't specifically say that this is only for the land sector. This might actually be an adjustment for force majeure that affects other sectors as well. But this has been a discussion, especially within the Kyoto Protocol countries, about the relative importance of these force majeure events or natural disturbances, because in the land sector they can create emissions that the party was not expecting and which were outside of their control. So this is related to the idea that we should be focusing the accounting, at least, on the issues where parties have some control over it and we're capturing the effect of their policies and actions, and we're not capturing the effects of events outside of their control. So it's worth keeping an eye on this paragraph, noting how it unfolds, thinking about, is this necessary or not? What might be some of the problems? In my personal view, I think the way it was handled under the Kyoto Protocol was relatively good and pretty robust, but because that was developed for the context of countries that have a lot of control over their land sector, there's not a lot of illegal activity or deforestation happening in those countries. To me, there's a question about whether that mechanism can be carried over directly to all other countries, in particular developing countries, where they don't necessarily have the same level of control over the sector. And so I think that's an issue worth looking at further as we get closer to Paris. Okay, next slide, please. And this is just going to sort of wrap up and tell you where I think things stand at the moment. So what we've seen through these 4 themes is that, first there's a lot of explicit references to the land sector, and to me that indicates that the land sector overall is pretty firmly anchored in the Paris text so far, especially these repeated references to RED+. And so we're in a position where those could be defended to make sure that the land sector does play an appropriate role in the Paris Agreement. The second point here is that we also have a lot of implicit references that would provide hooks or linkages to the land sector, and those would just serve to strengthen its status within the agreement. And these can be leverage points for folks who think that the land sector is important and want to see it continue to be included. So what I mean by leverage points is that to be able to say, well, if we're going to sufficiently protect food production, for example, then we need policies that are applied, and we need the agreement to ensure that it covers the land sector in a way that brings that, that makes sure that that food production is protected. And there are a few other ideas like that embedded in the text that could be used in that way. Number 3, we do see that we have well-elaborated principles within the text in a couple different places. So they're represented there, and in my view, they're probably more or less adequate for what we would like to see in the sense of environmental integrity, but they're not really prominent in the agreement. They do have a fair bit of support from various parties, but they may need to be, the 2 places where these occur, they might need to be rectified with each other. Their importance might need to be highlighted in the course of the negotiations, and then we may need to take action to defend them or encourage parties to defend these principles and not remove them from the overall agreement. We'd want to do that in a way that doesn't further complicate these principles, because the land sector is a place where it has become very complicated in the past, and that has led a lot of countries to just sort of throw up their hands and say, well, we can't deal with this, especially at the ministerial level, which is the level where the final Paris Agreement will be decided. All right, and then the fourth point here is that it's probably worthwhile to continue to monitor some of these issues that affect the land sector, and that they will have implications for the land sector that we should keep in mind. These issues can have cascading impacts, especially in the sense of like the force majeure idea, and yet the land sector itself on its own might not be the deciding point or the deciding factor in the decisions whether or not to include these or how. So it's something that we may not be able to affect the overall outcome in the agreement, but it's worth watching how it unfolds. All right, and with that, if you go to the next slide, you'll see where you can find this reference document that I've been going through, and I hope that you've appreciated this little guided tour of the text. And if you have any further questions or want to get in touch with me, there's my contact information. So thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks for really making the work of distilling the elements and the references that are relevant for the land sector from a text that is so long and somehow complicated to map out. So I think that this is very useful for everybody to know what are the explicit mentions, the implicit elements, and what are the principles that we have to take into consideration. I think it's really useful, and you did a wonderful work explaining the relevance without going into all the details that the different paragraphs and different options the text has. So thanks for that. And now, as we have discussed the guidance and the relevant provisions in the INDCs and the mentions and the relevant elements in the draft climate agreement, now we can open for questions and answers, and you can send your questions through the question box in the toolbox of the webinar, and I'm going to start reading them, and we have hopefully quite a few minutes to address your questions. So let me check if we have any questions. What we can also do is, if you want to pose a question, you can use the tool of raise your hand, and we can probably unmute you so you can ask your question directly. Okay. Wow, I don't see any questions so far, which is unusual. We normally get a lot of questions, so I'm going to give a few minutes just to give the opportunity for people to either type questions or raise hands, so we can take some of those.
And if you want, Josefina, in the meantime, I can just briefly talk about what we have seen in terms of the land use sectors in the dozen INDCs that have been submitted to date, if you're interested.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's very relevant as well, Pippa.
Great. So again, I'm not going to go into kind of any one specific country, but we have seen that the majority of INDCs submitted so far have included a reference to either emissions reductions or adaptation in the land sector, and most of them have not indicated a precise amount of the emissions reductions that will come from the sector, but they have all provided some amount of information in terms of the the base year and the methodological approaches that they will take to measure and account for emissions reductions in the sector. So I think, to date, and Josefina and Jason, feel free to jump in if you guys have additional opinions from what you've seen, but to date, we have seen that countries are interpreting the guidance in terms of what needs to be included in an INDC from Lima to apply to the land sector, and they are including it in their INDCs.
I think we do have a question, Josefina.
Yes, I'm going to read it. This question is from Will Ashley Cantello, and he's asking, he's saying, some have argued that because of the potential for the land sector in some countries to reduce their net emissions and reduce need for emission savings from non-land sectors, there should be gross and net targets for emissions in the convention. Could you offer a view on this?
I'm happy to tackle that unless Pipa wants to go first.
Go for it, and I'll add anything if needed.
Okay. So this is a really good question. It's an important question because of some of the distinctive characteristics of the land sector. And I think the person asking the question is trying to get at this idea of, do we need sort of separate targets or different approaches to single out the land sector from the others? And in my view, I think that's probably not necessary, and it's in some ways unhelpful to keep the land sector separate from the others in terms of accounting. But this idea of different approaches is one that's worth thinking about. We have a lot of experience in developing rules for the land sector that are aimed at this idea that we need to focus on the anthropogenic component of it. And in the land sector, we have both, we have non-anthropogenic things that are causing emissions and removals to occur, and so we need to try to focus them in. So the problem for me would be that if you took a gross approach to the land sector or to any sector, but especially the land sector, it would be mixing those things up together. The nice thing about the use of a net approach is that it ends up measuring what things have changed relative to some time in the past, and that's really the only way to get a good handle on whether or not we're actually reducing overall emissions through anthropogenic activities. So I would argue that some sort of separate target isn't really needed or helpful. In fact, we'd like to see mitigation happening wherever possible in the way that's most cost-effective, because that's going to be the way that we can achieve the most ambition per unit effort, I guess, is the way to think about it. So in my ultimate assessment, I think it's about the level of the targets, that we don't need to separate out the land sector, but we need to have sufficient ambition reflected in the economy-wide targets especially, so that we can bring in the land sector in a way that also means we need a lot of reductions from the other sectors too. So I think creating some kind of firewall between them would be unhelpful in that respect. It's more about how do we make sure the overall ambition is high enough to ensure reductions everywhere. Pipa, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree, Jason. I think the land sector is just part of a piece of the puzzle, and I don't think that it would be either feasible in terms of technology or social acceptability to not ambitiously reduce emissions from other sectors simply because the land sector is being addressed. So I think it is all about overall ambition, and the objective of the convention can't be met by not reducing fossil fuel emissions either. So this all needs to be part of the package.
Thank you, Jason and Pipa, for providing your views. We have another question from Madeleine Hall, and she's saying, well, Jason discussed in paragraph 39 of the preamble a preference for MBIs. Are there any explicit, implicit guidance on how to design these tools? Are there any lessons learned from previous application of MBIs in the land use sector?
MBIs, can somebody remind me what we're referring to there?
Oh, MBIs, market-based instruments. Madeline says,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so is there explicit or implicit guidance on how to develop these? Well, I think that these have largely been developed starting at the national or even subnational level. There's a lot of guidance through the efforts in California, example, for a cap-and-trade system there. And then those have been built up in, for example, the EU ETS system to apply to a multi-country context. So for market-based instruments, I think there is a lot of existing experience and guidance, and in some cases where we've made some mistakes that have been corrected, or some of them still need to be corrected. I'm sure that Maddie is aware of my experience in New Zealand working on the ETS system there, where the forestry sector is included in that system, and folks there can generate credits that they can sell on the market within the ETS system, just like reductions from any other. And there's been a lot of work to try to make sure that that system has environmental integrity. There have also been problems in New Zealand and elsewhere. In New Zealand, for example, some of the higher level policy decisions ended up having the effect of reducing the carbon price to such an extent that it no longer triggered any real action in the forestry sector. In fact, it triggered some perverse actions as a result of those decisions, even though the forestry sector component was probably pretty robust and well designed. I would also point to the CDM as an example of a market-based instrument that has encountered problems both through the land sector methodologies of the CDM. The process of implementing them has created a significant bottleneck, so we've hardly seen any real projects move through and get approval through those methodologies, and it's been difficult for them to sustain financial support for those projects, even though they were doing pretty good things on the ground. And then finally, because of those bottlenecks and the relative onerousness of the process, we haven't seen a lot of innovation, which is what the CDM was intended to spur. We've just seen a reliance on really straightforward, not very innovative practices in the CDM in order to make sure that they have the maximal chance of getting support. So that, I would say, has led to some unintended consequences, or a failure to leverage the benefits we could have gotten from that mechanism. And at the same time, elsewhere, in other sectoral activities, we saw problems that drove down the value of CDM credits overall to such an extent that, once again, the price was so low that it didn't really trigger any meaningful action on the ground, especially in the land sector. That's a place where differences in the way land sector credits were treated ended up really disadvantaging them relative to even other project activities that were probably didn't have the same level of environmental integrity, and that was an unfortunate missed opportunity. Pipa, do you want to add anything there?
No. Thanks, Jason. And I think, yeah, I think this discussion about the new market mechanism under the convention is it's an issue that has been under discussion under the UNFCCC for quite a while, and it's been controversial, and it's been progressing very slowly. So we have to yet see how the broader discussions that are not exclusively related to the land sector or to RED or to CDM, but just in general, how to talk about a new market mechanism in the context of the climate convention may play out in the road to Paris, or maybe we'll just have to wait to see the discussions after Paris.
I think it was quite obvious in the Bonn meeting that the parties know that this is going to be challenging. Even in the discussion of the mitigation section in the ADP, when they tried to sort of open this up and say, all right, now we're going to tackle this paragraph 39, which deals with market mechanisms, among other things. I was sitting in the room and heard, several interventions sort of saying, gosh, we have to tackle this right now. They all know that it's going to be a tough thing to wrestle with, and so they wanted to deal with some other issues first. So I guess it's a matter of stay tuned and wait and see how that pans out, but I imagine it's going to be a difficult discussion.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jason. We have another question from Viral Bludgdea, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, about, it's the comparability of INDCs is dropped. So effort can be controlled on long term. And I think I'm going to unmute you, so probably you can elaborate a little bit more on your question. I think now you can speak. Viral, are you there? Would you want to pose your question?
And if not, maybe I can just try to start answering, and then if it doesn't fully answer the question, then between Jason and I, then maybe we can have it asked again. But I think, it is true that because INDCs are nationally determined and the guidance is general, there is very little comparability between them or among them from multiple countries. And certainly from those of us who are interested in transparency, environmental integrity, ambition, and effort over the long term, that is something that we need to take into consideration. But kind of the world we're living in right now in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is one that is constantly struggling between the balance of broad participation, having all countries be able to contribute to the agreement, and also the strictness of guidance and approaches. So that's a constant balancing act between participation and kind of strictness of guidance. So right now I just do want to reiterate that we haven't seen any specific targets, pledges, INDCs, however you want to call the numbers, for land use. So that certainly also it reduces comparability, but also just kind of indicates that what's really important is also what happens after Paris. So after Paris, we might have additional guidance for countries. There might be kind of an agenda created from the package of agreements in Paris that allows for parties to negotiate more guidance on how they account for emissions from the sector, and that might help with comparability. And also, just as countries start to implement this and start reducing their emissions and then reporting on that, that's really what we're going to have to compare. Right now, these are just indications of what countries are going to do, and we're really going to have to make sure that this turns into real ambition within each of those countries. Jason, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would make a few additional comments. This idea of comparability is really important, and it's something that is we're witnessing a process now, as the person mentioned in the question or sort of suggests, that's very bottom up, and the Paris Agreement, as I understand it, is really trying to get to a point where we have as much participation as possible by as many countries as possible, and that's really key to solving the problem of climate change. There's no question about that. But on top of that, so we're looking at a process where, okay, tell us what you want to do. Let's see that you're making meaningful efforts at a national scale to do that. And in some cases, we're asking countries who have the capacity to do so to support others. That's very useful, and that bottom-up process is necessary, I think, at this stage. But for those who are interested in the kinds of efficiencies that can be gained when we have, let's call them market-based approaches, but it could actually extend beyond just market-based approaches, those who are interested in this idea of how we can use emissions trading to make sure that we're maximizing the mitigation we get for the activities that we see worldwide, those really have to be underpinned by this idea of comparability. It is one of the 5 principles of the IPCC guidance in terms of principles for good practice in reporting and accounting. And it's there because it's telling us whether or not a ton of emissions or a ton of removals measured in any country or in any sector is the same as every other ton. And that's just an important way to make sure that we're talking about the same thing, and that allows countries to compare to each other what they're doing, and that comparability is important if there's going to be any exchange or payments for performance that occur. It's just necessary to see what's really happening on the other end. Now, it's also possible that along with those tons of reductions or emissions, there's a lot of other stuff going on that's associated with that. In many cases, there are lots of co-benefits that can go along with emissions reductions from REDD+, for example. But the unit of measurement itself and the comparability of those measurements is really essential for making sure that we can be clear about what's happening, and that helps to support this notion that there can be emissions trading supported by markets down the road. So I think right now the process we're seeing where comparability is not very emphasized is okay for this stage of the game, but down the road it's going to be necessary to start building in more elements of comparability and ensuring that it's clear what the relationship is between one country's activities with another, or one sectoral set of activities, how that compares to other sectors as well.
Thank you, Jason. I think there's, I want to put another question out there for you and Pippa, and it's about, given how, what we are seeing in the INDCs, as Pippa was explaining, and we've been discussing, it's more general and not very specific information about the land sector. Given that countries are putting that forward, what are the risks that we can identify if the new climate agreement does not really clarify the role of the land sector, or the mentions or the principles that we've been discussing during your presentation, Jason, are not really reaffirmed and are erased from the draft? What are the risks that you see moving forward?
I can start.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean that's a huge question, Josefina, but I think I'll kind of take it from 2 different angles, and then I'm sure Jason can add more. But one in terms of kind of environmental outcome, both climate-related and not climate-related, and then the other in terms of kind of incentivizing the outcomes that we want to see. So I think the first is that if we don't have either countries stepping forward and including emissions from the land sector, or countries kind of, or if we don't have kind of those principles that Jason spoke to, then obviously we have the risk that this isn't included in the climate agreement. And that is obviously a bad outcome when we kind of look at what's happening around the globe right now, where there is deforestation, where there are degraded lands that aren't being restored, et cetera. And I think certainly from TNC's point of view, and probably from the point of view of some others on this call, those are activities that we really want to incentivize. We want to reduce deforestation. We want to restore degraded lands. We want to protect ecosystems that provide so much more than just carbon. And that kind of gets to the incentives piece, which is, one of the reasons that we are talking about all of these activities within the Climate Convention is not only because, some of these activities either contribute to climate change or have the option to mitigate because they can sequester carbon. The overall climate deal can really create the incentives, either some of the market-based incentives Jason was just talking about, or others, to get the conservation outcomes that we're all interested in. So if there isn't specific space for the land use sector in the Paris Agreement, then it's really hard to envision a way forward in which we can have, with a lot of environmental integrity, the outcomes that we want in ecosystem. There will be very few incentives to do that.
I can just add a little bit to that. Those were really the essential points that Pippa just made. But in terms of the risks that I see beyond that, I guess I would put them kind of in two different buckets. One is that if there's not sufficient guidance or we don't have an agreement from the countries to abide by a set of principles, we have some experience in the past, and I'm deeply familiar with it in the Kyoto Protocol context, where we saw that there were countries driving toward things that would have perverse outcomes within their own country, creating sets of rules in order to limit their liabilities down the road or allow certain types of practices that probably didn't have great environmental integrity at the end of the day. And so if we don't have an agreement to these sets of principles and we don't have parties acting in good faith, we can end up having those kinds of outcomes play out within individual countries. And then the second bucket, I think, is that we can have things that actually are probably well-intended, would have environmental integrity, and they're proposed by countries who want to make good things happen, but they end up being misused somewhere else, or they create an opening or a bit too much flexibility that allows perverse outcomes to happen elsewhere. So even if they're well intended by the country that proposes them, they end up causing problems elsewhere if these rules are embedded and everyone has access to these mechanisms. So that's why it's really important to have agreement to an overarching set of principles we can use to sort of say, all right, let's look and see as INDCs happen, as implementation happens, whether or not these principles are being met, and we can use them as a bit of a standard to guide us, and also call for parties to then say, well, this is problematic, or these more detailed rules aren't really supporting the kinds of principles that you agreed, so we need to change them. Those are the ways that we can utilize these principles to help avoid the risks, and I expect that we will need some further elaboration about how those principles get built into a further set of guidance or some subsequent agreements that within the UNFCCC context that can then take effect after 2020. So I think it's really essential to have those in there because you have these potential problems of either within country perverse outcomes or perverse outcomes that end up happening across countries.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to both for those answers. And there's another question from Joanna House. She's asking, will food security complicate or limit land-based mitigation? The science on, I think, land use change is currently very uncertain. If countries have to prove land-based mitigation won't impact food production, it could really limit what can be done as is happening for biofuels?
I can start to tackle that if you want.
Sure, go ahead.
I can't see the actual question, unfortunately, but I think I caught the gist of it.
Yeah, I can repeat it because I received it through email. So it's will food security complicate or limit land-based mitigation? And she goes further saying the science on land use change, I think, it's currently very uncertain. If countries have to prove land-based mitigation won't impact food production, it could really limit what can be done as it is happening for biofuels.
Yeah, okay. I'm not sure if I would characterize the science as being really uncertain. I think that there are a lot of places where there's such a range of different outcomes possible from land management activities that you really have to sort of know the specific context and drill down into it to find out what types of outcomes are being achieved on the ground in terms of both mitigation and food production, which supports food security. So that's a place where we need more precise and specific information. It's not necessarily the case that everything's uncertain. So then the question about could food security concerns end up limiting what can be achieved in terms of mitigation in the land sector, that's something of a possibility, but you know, there's quite a bit of momentum and interest in the scientific community and within countries about looking for these places where synergies can occur, where you can have yields increase from crop production, for example, at the same time that emissions are going down. And this is becoming a pretty exciting area of research, and beyond sort of the research setting, it's happening in a lot of projects around the world that are moving from a demonstration phase into actually pretty large-scale implementation on the ground. One good example is the System of Rice Intensification, or SRI, which is being used throughout many parts of Southeast Asia where rice is grown, and it's being used over hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of hectares of land at this point. That process, or that approach to rice cultivation, is one that really reduces the emissions of methane in rice cultivation, and at the same time it can boost yields, and it's a more cost-effective way to grow rice. So the farmers are seeing benefits in terms of reduced costs, higher yields, and as a consequence their emissions are going down too. So those types of really places where we can have synergies across these things, I think is going to be exciting, and when we incorporate these different issues in an agreement, it helps to stimulate those kinds of activities and give them a leg up on sort of the conventional practices. And I would also say that it's becoming more and more clear through research that more traditional practices, or oftentimes practices that we would call organic farming, end up having these benefits or having these synergies that occur in the sense that overall emissions are lower, and if done right, they can have comparable or even higher yields than conventional agriculture, especially because, or what we call industrial agriculture, because in the long run, these industrial approaches tend to degrade the ecosystems that are supporting the agriculture, and so their carbon stocks go down, and they require a lot of inputs to keep them going. So I would say having these two things considered simultaneously isn't a disadvantage, it's actually an advantage, and it's going to help stimulate and incentivize more sustainable systems, is what I hope, at least. Pipa, you want to add something?
Yeah, I just want to add that, you know, the question of food security goes even farther beyond just the land use sector, because it is about so many different, there's so many different pieces to it. So, you know, synergies could also try to be identified in other parts of mitigation. So, for example, how does a shift in transportation systems, for example, to lower carbon transportation systems, how could that also enhance distribution that impacts food security? So I think, you know, the question of food security is one that applies to the whole agreement overall, and that's why the idea of safeguards, which were kind of have been introduced in the strongest way thus far through RED, which is a land use system, the idea of kind of ensuring that there are safeguards and that broader societal considerations are part of the package, I think is really important. But I think, you know, questions like food security and some other issues that come up in safeguards need to be considered at the higher level, not just within the land use sector.
Thank you, Pipa and Jason. I think we are reaching almost the end of our time in the webinar, but I just wanted to end with a reflection where you see our additional resources in the screen, where you can consult other resources from WWF, but also where this webinar is going to be put in our YouTube channel, so you can listen to it again or share it with anybody interested. But the reflection I wanted to make is, well, even as we've seen the process moving forward with the country's INDCs and with the discussions in the new climate agreement and how the elements for the land sector are going to be reflected, whether they are more explicitly included or more, if the agreement becomes more sector neutral, and we still manage to get the right hooks, as we were referring them to before, to make sure that the land sector is considered and is represented in the climate agreement. I think for me it's important to understand that the end of the road is not going to be Paris, even if we have the best scenario where the elements are included and the land sector is recognized, because there's a lot of work to do after Paris in terms of harmonization, about really figuring out how the best elements of the current accounting frameworks that exist at the moment, whether it's RED+, whether it's LULUCF, or even the provisions for the CDM, how does post-Paris world look like for the land sector, and what is, I think it's important to recognize that there's going to be more work and more discussions to tackle after the agreement is hopefully approved. That is just like my final message, but I don't know if Pippa, Jason, you want to say something to wrap up.
No, just thank you, Josefina and WWF, for hosting.
Yes, thank you guys, and thanks to the participants for tuning in and spending some time talking about these issues. We really appreciate the attention.
Yep, thank you to both of you to sharing your views and to do such a fantastic job distilling the elements for the land sector and what is important. We try to be very factual and to just like inform and communicate. But please let us know if you have any questions. You have the contact information for Pippa and Jason and for us in WWF. So thank you so much for joining.